This is a second part of a video I'd done talking about the terminology used in the communications business, primarily the voice communications, aka the telephone business, up to 1984. We're in 2022 and the terminology still has some merit. However, with things moving over to IP-based technology, lots of things have changed, and I may cover that in a future video, depending on how much interest there is. If people would like to see some of that, I have a little bit of knowledge in that area, and I would be happy to make a video maybe covering some of that. Presently, we're looking at a central office that is made up of multiple switching systems. The reason I'm taking this section of the video here in the office is one of the parts of the terminology will be referred to as the CO, or the central office. When you're looking at documentation, it'll be very common to see reference to the CO, or central office. They also have, depending on what vintage of telephones you're working on, and if they're single line or business phones, there's also another term that will be used primarily in the key system world as CO/PBX. As far as the phone itself is concerned, there's virtually no difference between a central office and a PBX, other than a PBX is typically found on a premise such as a hospital, lumber yard, very large, like a sawmill for an example, hotel, motel, and that type of stuff. As far as the phone's concerned, it's still just a tip and ring line. You may have a 24 volt system versus a 48 volt system. However, the ringing is pretty much the same, the signaling is pretty much the same. So those two terms are kind of interchangeable, and they do have meaning further into the communications industry, but for the basic discussion of this video, they're interchangeable and they have effectively no difference. In addition to the switching system that you just saw, this is also a central office of the manual type. This was installed in areas that did not have automatic service, and this is a relatively new board. I will show a couple other switchboards that were also referred to as CO, or central office technology. The switchboard that is on the left is a central office switchboard as well. This was made in the very early zeros of 1900, of course, and it is a magneto-only switchboard. So you would have the magnetophones, aka crank phones, that would be connected to this. The telephone switchboard that's got all my junk piled on it to the right is a PBX switchboard, and that is a common battery switchboard, which would utilize 300 series type telephones, such as a 302, Candlestick phones, and so forth. Both of these were made by Western Electric companies, and the switchboard prior to these were also a Western Electric switchboard. This is a Northern Electric switchboard, which was the Western Electric of Canada. Presently, it's not functional. It does not need much to make it work, but I don't have it working, and sorry about all of the junk I have piled on it. This is a sometime down the road project. A brief shot of some of the phones in my single line display room. As I was saying before, when it comes to terminology, every phone has kind of its own identifier, as in model, depending on the manufacturer. So for an example, the top row of phones that we're looking at are what is referred to as 2554. Western Electric, ITT, and Stromberg manufactured these phones, as well as Northern Electric and some knockoffs. The phones below the top row were also manufactured by a couple of different companies. The rotary dial ones were manufactured by Stromberg Carlson only, and they look identical to the touch tone, with the exception of one being rotary and one being tone, of course. And the rotary ones were a Bell System design. However, the Bell System did not actually manufacture and produce them. They licensed them, and to the best of my knowledge, the only company that made the rotary dial mini wall was Stromberg.
6:00 p.m. Temperature 66 degrees.
It's always the computer at the wrong time. Then the manufacturers made these phones in different colors. However, not every manufacturer made these phones in every color. The bright orange and lime green was made by Stromberg and ITT, but Western Electric did not make bright orange or lime green phones. There may have been a special occasion that they would do a color for a specific customer, such as a Hilton or something along that lines, but they were not done for general release to the public. The phones below, there are two shelves of them. Those are referred to as Princess phones. Stromberg and ITT Western did make these phones, and I have representation of the three of them. The Stromberg phones is slightly different. The ITT is about the same, and the Northern Electric is about the same. Automatic Electric made a Starlight phone in both the mini wall, which is similar to what we're looking at, and in the Princess format. They called them Style Line phones. Automatic Electric equipment had its own unique set of colors that was not necessarily made by the other manufacturers. And if you're working on Automatic Electric phones, you must have the proper schematic for that specific phone. They never made two of anything alike. Western, ITT, and Stromberg, for the most part, you could use an ITT schematic to fix a Stromberg or Western phone, or when I should say that, wire one up, because they were very similar. With Automatic Electric, there's nothing even remotely close to one another, and there is no interchangeable parts between Automatic Electric and anybody else, including most Automatic Electric stuff. I don't focus on AE. I do have a few phones, but there's not a huge demand for the plastic Automatic Electric phones. The metal phones and the Bakelite phones, they made a lot of different models, and there's a lot of collectors of those phones, and they made some pretty nice looking phones. And in many ways, their phones were very durable and well built. They were not enjoyable to work on, but they did function fairly well. The touch-tone phones that we have here in this video is what's called a 2554. There was a 1554 that was missing the star and the pound keys, and the pound symbol was out and known as a pound symbol long before we got into the perverted internet age that people are calling it a hashtag. So the documentations are generally referred to as a pound sign. The rotary dials, in this particular case of the Stromberg phones that we are looking at, the mini walls, they're interchangeable with almost everybody's Princess phones. except for, of course, AE. The colors that we're looking at here represent the different manufacturers, Western, ITT, and Stromberg. The manufacturers did not make all of the colors that the other manufacturers made. An example is the bright orange and the lime green were made by Stromberg and ITT. However, the Bell system did not manufacture lime green or bright orange. The Bell system did have a burnt orange, which was a darker orange in their trimline series of telephones. But nobody else made the burnt orange. And depending on the operating phone company at the time, not all colors were offered to their customers. ITT and Stromberg would make colors if you were a hotel motel chain like Motel 6 or the Hilton. You could go to them and ask for phones in a certain color and they would make them. And of course, only the independent mom and pop phone companies would be able to supply them to you. The Bell system did make custom colors for very large sized hotels and motels that wanted orange phones or whatever in their rooms. So they do exist, but they're quite rare. When it comes to the terminology, the manufacturers of this time period, mostly the colored phones, used a 3 or 4 digit numbering scheme. 3 digits typically meant it was a rotary dial phone, and 4 digits, if the initial digit was a 2, generally represented a touch-tone phone. Now that is not something that is absolutely across the board 100% universal, but it's very accurate for the, I'm going to say 90% of the telephones made. The Western Electric design line phones of the mid 70s to the early 80s had 4 and 5 digit numbers. And those telephones were mostly Mickey Mouse phones, chest phones, and chalkboard phones and so forth, that the phone company actually owned the electrical components and the customer owned the shell. Only the Bell system, to the best of my knowledge, done that. The independent telephone companies did not do that. You could actually outright buy phones from the independent companies, the specialty phones, I believe. I lived in a Bell system area, so I only know of their rental program. And then, of course, after divestiture, AT&T retained ownership of all the Bell system phones, and the independent phone companies, which owned the phones in many cases, simply just gave them to the customers. The smaller companies did. The larger ones may have continued the leasing program, but when the phone broke, it was your problem. They didn't want to maintain it anymore. And so there's a lot of different phones available for collecting of different colors. The more odd the color, the more desirable it is. One of the things that also was done by all of the manufacturers, or I should say by refurbishers and by AT&T and the Bell system, is they painted the plastic shells when the phones were returned to the refurbishing center. The company-owned refurb centers out there, and there was a lot of them, would buy telephones from the telephone companies such as United Telephone, GTE, and so forth, and then they would take the phones and refurbish them and then sell them back to an independent company. And they used whatever parts they could get their hands on, A, and B, the colors that were faded, they would paint them some of the more neutral colors such as beige, ivory, and black, and ash. So you will run across telephone shells that were painted. The most desirable shells to have are the original non-painted shells. About 95% of the phones in my single line collection are non-painted phones. In my business phones, which was a previous video, a good percentage of those phones were painted due to the fact that the colors were not very desirable in the 70s and the 80s. As I stated in the first episode, the telephones we're looking at, this is only half of the phone. These are Candlestick phones, and they have been refurbished, and they're connected to bell boxes or subsets, which I will show in a moment. These are the bell box subsets for the Candlestick phones, as well as some more bell box and subsets for the D-mount 102s, 202s, and so forth. These are the D-mounts, 102s, and so forth. These are only half the phone. I just showed the bell box subsets for these phones. So if you find these phones, and they're very common, you only got half the phone unless you find a box that they connected to, which is kind of uncommon. The blue telephone is a salesman sample, and it's a non-functional phone, but it's a cute little phone, and they do exist from time to time on eBay. As I stated in the first episode, there were induction coils, which are specialized transformers, and then this is a 4-bar magneto, and then down below is my batteries for making this phone functional. However, they would have had larger dry cells. But here we're looking at one of the condensers, aka capacitor. If you live in Idaho, you may refer to this as a capacitator. This is a Western Electric phone, and you'll have the induction coil at the very top, and then we have the condenser, aka capacitor. This particular one has a 5-bar magneto in it, and then down below would be the battery box for the batteries to operate the transmitter in the phone. It was very common for the wood phones and some of the early metal phones to have the schematic attached to the front of the telephone. And if it survived, that is how that phone is supposed to be wired. This information, again, is available in both of the club's libraries. When dealing with some of the more vintage phones, unlike modern plastic phones, there was no standard numbering. Each manufacturer had their own set of numbers for their phones. So when dealing with these, you have to be able to figure out what kind of a phone you have, which may require spending time in a catalog of that manufacturer. Generally, there will be some kind of a marking somewhere in the phone to tell you who the phone was made by. Of course, when those telephones was refurbished by different companies, they again just had parts made by anybody and everybody, and they interchanged them just to make general purpose telephones. So you could find some of the magneto phones with Kellogg, which later became ITT, Automatic Electric, American Electric, Western Electric, Stromberg, you name it, you could find all kinds of parts because they pretty much functioned the same and were fairly interchangeable. We have a subset bell box here, which is a Western Electric, so it's got a straight line ringer in it, a magneto, and then that is connected to my nickel Western Electric Candlestick. This is sitting next to my long distance 3CL switchboard, which I have done videos on the switchboards. Kind of a quick overview of some of the other types of telephones made. These telephones were made in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and very, very early 60s. ITT, Kellogg, Western, Automatic Electric, and so forth. And again, these all had their own different numbers. So research needs to be done on the phone in order to know what you have. During the late 20s, 30s, when there was a transition in the telephones from what was referred to as a two-piece, the receiver was an item you held in one hand to your ear, and then the transmitter was what you spoke into that was on the base of the phone. This was referred to as a two-piece phone. During the transition time, when they were getting away from that, such as the top phone with the receiver on the left side and the transmitter in the front, which that particular phone is what's called an apartment phone. So it has access to a telephone line or an internal intercom. Below is a 211 handset hanger phone. During the transition to the handset, they referred in the documentation to it being a handset type phone, and that gave you an idea that the phone was a more modern phone. I'm not sure if that was a universal term amongst all of the manufacturers, but that was the beginning of the complete one-piece handset, which was a big improvement. If you've ever actually talked on a phone where you had to hold the receiver unit and then have your mouth right up next to the transmitter, those are not comfortable, and the general public very quickly wanted to go to the handset type phone because they were much more comfortable. Of course, in the early days, when you had any kind of a phone, regardless of who made it or the style, you were just happy to have a phone where you could talk to your neighbor or someone down the road, where you did not have to go out and get on your horse and ride over there or crank up to Model A or Model T. So you would use what was available at the time. And if you see some of the very old movies, they show people using the two-piece phones. However, again, in the 20s on, that's when they transferred or began the migration over to the what we call a handset phone today. And there were many different types of handsets made by the different manufacturers. And there's an enormous amount of technical information on just the handset itself. And I don't want to get into that because that could be a 2-hour video talking about just handsets by themselves. But there was that change. So the documentation will refer to that. And again, the two telephone collector club libraries have a lot of great information on some of this stuff. Some of the very early 554 telephone sets had colored backboards, which would mount onto the wall, and then the 554 would mount onto the backboard. These are fairly rare to find, and they made them in a lot of the different colors. The two plastic covers to the left was the modern ones that covered up the 630 type wall plate, because if you put a phone that had a modular adapter plate on it or was made modular, it would have a gap between the jack and the wall, and this plate kind of filled that gap in. That was a short-lived thing made by most of the manufacturers. At the very top, I'm showing some modern ringer boxes, but the very, very top is some of the jacks that were made that was pre-modular. So if you paid extra money, you could have a jack installed or multiple jacks, and then you could unplug the phone and move it to different jacks. That was not that common. Here is a turquoise telephone, and sitting to the right of it is a blue telephone. The turquoise phone is a Northern Electric telephone. You can tell by the touch tone pad being a dark black plastic. That generally was an indicator it was made by Northern Electric. There was a few offshoots later into the 80s that used the black plastic as well, but in the old vintage phones like this, that pretty much told you it was a Northern Electric from a distance. Also, it's common to find telephones such as what we're looking at with a switch down in the lower left corner. These telephones could be two-line phones. They could be a phone that had a grounding button, which was used in special applications, or if it was a 511PU, for an example, or a few phones in that series, it could have a lamp, and that switch would either adjust the brightness of the lamp. Here's my version of the 511 type phone. So there's a little lamp under this cap, which is almost always missing, and then the switch down here would either turn the light off and on or dim it, depending on the model of the phone and what it was intended to do. I have a ringer box with the cover removed, and that's a standard C4 type of a ringer made by Western Electric. The black tube may be found in certain telephones. That was used for party line ringing. It has no function today on the modern network. However, you may find it in a 500, 554, and some of the other series of phones. The older the phone, the larger the tube. One technical note is if you look at the telephone that's on the left, it has what's called an outside post or outside terminal receiver. Those are definitely close to turn of the century and earlier. They're very expensive and they're not very common. The payphone here has a standard receiver on it, and those are the most common. They were pretty much the same design amongst the manufacturers, but not necessarily interchangeable parts. I'll end this video with a couple of notes. I tried to provide some technical information and show some of the different models and the differences in them. There's such an incredibly huge variation age-wise as well as telephones. There is absolutely no one that is an expert on every single aspect of this. There are people who are very good at certain time period of phones that they're interested in. For the most part, the telephones that I have showed in this video are fairly simple phones. The whole concept behind a single line phone, they're not very difficult. And my recommendation is if a person wants to become a serious collector and have certain vintage phones, to dig into the libraries. And one of the great things is the phones of the pre-1900, as well as in the zeros, the teens, 20s, 30s, and 40s. There's a lot of photographs, a lot of catalogs that show them and describe them, and those are available. So the information is fairly simple to find, at least for the North American telephones made by the 4 major manufacturers, kind of 5. I would not try to become a purist on any one specific manufacturer of phones, because there was a lot of variations made for very special applications that not necessarily every manufacturer tried to cover. Western Electric tried to cover every variation and everything due to the size of the bell system and being backed by AT&T. You had deep pockets, endless money. The independent manufacturers made phones that were specialty phones for a niche, but not necessarily every aspect. So ITT / Kellogg, Strasbourg, and Automatic Electric all had phones that had variations for some unique situation that was not very common. And those phones do exist, and amongst some of the collectors, those are sought after. It's not realistic to try to have one of everything that's ever made. You would just have thousands of phones. The serious collectors, such as myself and probably 20 to 30 others, try to have every one variation of everything in every color. And some people have been very successful at acquiring those types of things. So if you find a phone that's not common, especially at a thrift store, secondhand store, and so forth, consider yourself lucky. There are early 500 sets that were made in 49 and up by basically Western Electric that are highly sought after and just hideously expensive. Also, anything made by Western Electric that has an F number on it meant it was a field trial phone that they made a few hundred of them, put them in the field to see how they stood up, how the customers liked them, and so forth. And those are highly sought after and quite valuable. The F series numbers, I believe the TCI library has an enormous amount of information on them. There's other websites that talk about the F series numbers. It's got an enormous amount of documentation. Automatic Electric telephones, they had lots of variations, and the automatic numbering scheme I've never figured out. The most common ones are the 80s and 90s, which is a equivalent to Western ITT Stromberg 500, somewhat design, and then the wall phone that's somewhat similar to design as the 554. However, their numbering system was kind of cryptic. ITT numbering system had information that became immediately irrelevant after the phone was put into the field for the most part. They included if it had a ringer, the frequency of the ringer, and the color of the phone. So the moment that phone had a different ringer put into it or removed, the number information on the bottom of the phone become incorrect. So the first 3 to 4 digits may be correct, but the rest of the information that was stamped on it could be bogus information. So if you find something that has 500 LR03 or something to that degree, it tells you it's less ringer and it's a black phone. Don't try to get carried away with finding the documentation like that, because you probably won't. Just look for 500 or 2500. Automatic Electric numbers, you have to have that specific document for that specific phone. That's the end of the story about AE. I'm not an AE fan, never claimed to be, and I've said many times they never made two of anything alike, and that may not be 100% true, but it's more true than untrue. Anyway, if you like this video, give me a thumbs up, share it with people. If you have comments or would like to, please comment, and if there's things of interest that I can provide a video for that's not too detailed, such as how to completely refurbish a phone from the ground up, such as every model, I just will not do that. There's a lot of videos on YouTube of people working on different things, so just do a YouTube search, and you will find endless methods and procedures. Some of them I would endorse, others I would run from, but without watching everything out there, I could not provide any detail. As I think about it, I might provide another somewhat technical video for payphones and possibly the business phones. The business telephone systems are complex, and I do have an enormous amount of videos discussing different aspects of the business telephones, but the focus of that is for the more seasoned individual. If you're starting out, start out with single line phones and learn from there. And a real serious phone collector has 20 to 30 phones and up. If you only got two or three and you're dabbling with it, wonderful. It can be a fun hobby. Enjoy yourself and you can learn. And I will in the future produce a video of a certain type of a telephone system that's relatively inexpensive and plentiful on eBay so that you could hook up a handful of phones and call between them and so forth. And I would discuss that in the future. Have a great day.